Hello class, it's Monday afternoon at the end of instructional week 2, and I'm making this video so you'll have it to start out week 3 with. Last week, you'll remember, we spent the week talking about race and linguistics. There was a lot of really great conversations in our discussions, and I appreciate how much nearly everybody focused on the content in the text a little bit more than perhaps their own opinions, or managed to blend those two together in the discussion, which is just great. You know, living in the US, we all have a pretty clear experience of race, and sometimes it can be hard to read about that topic and still do a good job of conveying that information in the discussion when we all have so many things to say about the topic in general. Okay, so starting week 3, before tomorrow comes along, you might not see this video till tomorrow, I want to remind you that your assignment 2 is due by the end of today, by Monday at midnight. You'll remember, since this is a written assignment, you are allowed to turn it in up to 3 days past tonight, which means you can turn it in on Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. But as I say in my faculty expectations, and as it says on the assignment itself, you will receive 10% less of the points that you would have received per each of those days that you take. So basically your grade drops an entire letter grade each day that you're late until Thursday midnight, and then you get a 0. So turn your paper in on time, get all the points. We spent a lot of time discussing race this last week, and I do want to make one quick clarification about the difference between racism and racialism, 3 topics that often get sort of tangled up as we're discussing them. You'll remember from our reading that race is this idea that there are biologically distinct groups that we can put people into. Now, anthropology does not necessarily believe that there are distinct biologically defined groups, that we all know what they are, that they're the same everywhere, and that we can divide people up clearly and neatly within those groups. In fact, anthropology would argue that the groups we see of as distinct races actually have more variation within the groups than they do between them. This is not to say that race does not have reality in the US, because we certainly have a whole bunch of cultural ideas, stereotypes, discrimination, perhaps positive ideas about different racial and ethnic groups that are part of our experience and are experienced daily by people who belong to different assigned racial groups. But we want to be very clear that anthropology does not believe that there are these really clear-cut groups. You are white, you are black. We know what that is everywhere. It is unchangeable, immutable, stays as it is. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is racism, okay? We also, again, think that we have a good idea what racism is as well, but I just want to be very clear with you all that there's a difference between racial discrimination and racism. Anybody can experience racial discrimination. I think that my group, this is just an example, my group is better than any other group, and I think that the world should be organized that way. Racial discrimination. I think that, again, this is not my personal opinion, I think that affirmative action is wrong, and it gives lots of extra benefits to people of color, and I, as a white person, feel discriminated against in that process. I might think that, I don't. I might think that, and that might be an experience of racial discrimination, but it is not an experience of racism, because racism is not just this group of stereotyped ideas we have about the different races, but it's also connected to power, that we live within a system that has institutionalized hierarchical system, right, that has white people on the top and people of color below it, okay? And you can't experience a racism unless you are a person who is not that group on top. White people not having an experience of racism, not in the US, not anywhere else in the world. Doesn't matter if we were living someplace that white people were in a minority, unless we were in a minority that the group above us had significant institutional power over us, which is not the case. Okay, And then the third thing is racialism. And that's sort of the system we grew up in. We all grew up in it. I did, you did, everybody did. That this system, that our ideas about race are real, that they are biological, that we can look at people, make an assumption from looking at them and their physical appearance about what their economic means are, where they probably went to school, where they live, how smart they are, how capable they are. Racialism. Okay, so I'm going to be really clear that even though anthropology believes that there are not distinct and clear racial groups, and that in fact different cultures all over the world divide their population up into different numbers of races because we can't even decide what it is in the first place, that doesn't mean that race does not have a cultural reality in our society, one that we all experience every day. So I just want to be clear about that too. Race, totally culturally real, not biologically real. Okay. As we move on, next week, we're going to talk about gender, which I'm very excited about. It's the work that I do myself. This is my favorite week of the class. But I do want to give you a little pointer about one of the discussions we're going to have. It asks you to discuss an alternative gender. And by that, we are not trying to get at this culture does masculine and feminine different than we do here. And so I'm going to talk about that. For instance, some random mysterious country, right, in which it's okay and totally acceptable for men, heterosexual men, to hold hands walking around in public. I myself find that to be totally outside of, again, I'm making an example, outside of what would be acceptable for the gender roles in my country, and that would be an alternative gender role. Not what we're trying to get at. What we're trying to get at is cultures that have more than two possibilities for gender, more than masculine and feminine. Not just a culture where the way they do feminine is different from the way you understand feminine. Okay? So look for the cultural groups that are discussed in our text. The text discusses them as alternative genders or supernumerary genders, more than two, more than masculine and feminine. Okay, so my last little set of tips for this video is I want to remind you all that your rough drafts are due in this coming week, in week 3. You'll remember the rough draft and the final paper put together are 35% of your grade. That is a substantial amount of the points available in this class. So I have some helpful pointers. First of all, when you get done writing your rough draft, please sit down with a family member or a friend or a coworker and have them take a minute to listen to you read the paper aloud. I often find that when we're doing a research paper, you start putting together your thoughts, you draw out an outline maybe, you move things around, and before you know it, you can sort of lose the sense or the meaning in the paper. And by reading it out loud to another person, you can find the places where it doesn't quite make sense and fix it. That's particularly helpful for grammar and sentence structure errors. So please do that. Please be sure to look at both the tutorial in the assignment and the rubric in the assignment. As you may remember from the things you've had graded so far, everything at Ashford is graded using a rubric, which breaks down the elements that are required in the assignment and the points that are available for each. So after you finish your paper, look at the rubric and think to yourself, am I providing these things that are asked for? Have I clearly compared two groups? Do I have a thesis statement? Does my conclusion restate some of the things I said in the introduction? By doing that, you'll get the most points available. So please do that. I do want to remind you that this paper is intended to be based on two separate and distinct cultural groups that are not your own. So you don't want to compare the US to Japan. You don't want to compare two subcultural groups. So like, I'm going to talk about African American people in the US versus Latina people in the US. No. The only group within the US that would be possible in this paper would be if you were talking about a very specific Native American tribal group. Otherwise, stay away from the US entirely. You'll find that there's a tutorial in the week 3 assignment that is very helpful in finding cultural groups that speak to the topic you'd like to write about. So please take a look at that. I do want to remind you that your rough drafts are all run through Turnitin before they come to me. So if you are cutting and pasting anything from the internet, I will know, Turnitin will know you could receive a 0 on your paper. Please don't do that. And then the last thing I want to say is we're starting week 3. The rough draft and the final paper can seem overwhelming. There is a lot of help available for you. I'm so sorry. I have a terrible cold. So if I seem hard to hear, that's what it is. Okay, help available for your paper. Remember, there are links right in the assignment to the Writing Center for both instant chat help and for paper review. You can actually send your finished rough draft to them. They take like 48 hours and send it back to you with helpful hints in places where it's not strong enough, and that's super useful. There's also a handy little button over there that says Ask a Librarian if you're having trouble finding sources that speak to your paper and you've already looked through the tutorial, which will help you find sources. That's another good place to look. And the third place is that you can ask me for help at any point. Although I really want you to have read the assignment first and worked through the tutorial first, right? So use the resources you have and then come to me if you need more help. You can send me an email. We could set up a time on Skype to have office hours together. You could post a question if you think it is applicable to more than just you in the Ask Your Instructor under Meet Your Instructor on our left-hand margin. Yeah. So all of those, there's also a button at the top, email your professor. So all of those things, very handy. I look forward to reading really great rough drafts and giving you all a bunch of constructive feedback on the work that you've done so far. You should be receiving your assignment 2 back by the end of this week. Hopefully you learned a whole lot about how to construct a thesis statement. And I look forward to seeing you all next week.